Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. The battle over healthcare spending between Ottawa and the provinces seems no closer to getting resolved, even as hospitals across the country are under pressure.
We're going to continue to push on provinces to deliver real results for Canadians. We'll be there with investments, but we need to make sure that they're helping Canadians.
The Liberal government insists it will contribute more money, but not without better results.
We owe it to Canadians to come together and find immediate and longer-term solutions to address those challenges.
But this week, signs from the government's partner in supply and confidence agreements that the support is not guaranteed without action on healthcare.
If we don't see action on healthcare, we absolutely reserve the right to withdraw our support.
So does the threat to pull support move the needle on the healthcare issue, or is this a political bluff? Let's bring in our panelists, Chantal Hebert, Elamin, Abdelmahmoud, Althia Raj, and Andrew Coyne. Good to see everyone. Althia, why don't I start with you this week? What do you make of Jagmeet Singh's positioning on this and the realness of this threat?
It's not a real threat. It's a way for the NDP leader to get some headlines. It's a way for the NDP to tell the Liberals that they should not take their support for granted. But the Liberals and the NDP both know that the government is taking their support for granted. What's more puzzling about this is that usually you come out and you ask for something that you know the other guy's going to give you.
Right.
In this case, asking, for example, for the Prime Minister to sit down with the premiers is not a realistic ask because there is no deal on the table at the moment. So the PM is not going to meet with the premiers until there is a deal. So why would you ask for something the man cannot give you? That part is more troubling to me. But, you know, we've heard from the Bloc Québécois leader this week, and we know the Conservatives are not going to support the Liberals. So frankly, you know, if Mr. Singh wants to pull out of the agreement, who's going to support the budget? And not the NDP, certainly not the NDP, not the Liberals, want to have an election. So this is an empty threat, a pure headline for people like us to talk about the NDP.
Well, I guess that's some success then, because that's what we're doing. Chantal.
Yes, well, Mr. Singh is reserving the right to pull his support. He always has that right, so it's reserved permanently. That is what the deal is about, for one. Two, it would make more sense to say, we're going to pull the rug from under this government because this government is looking to introduce two-tier medicine. Something that you can say I'm an alternative to. Right. But even if we had an election tomorrow about healthcare, I'm not sure that it would be the ballot box issue. How do you frame it? The last time the NDP pulled its support from a Liberal government over healthcare issues goes back to Paul Martin. And that brought in a decade of Stephen Harper, and I think a lot of New Democrats remember that.
So is it worth then, Elamin, the Prime Minister and the government calling Singh on his bluff, or do you just let him play it out because, you know, what's the difference?
I mean, I do think you let him play it out for a couple of reasons. One is that, you know what, somebody should be concerned with the state of healthcare system in this country, and it might as well be Jagmeet Singh. I think it's actually good for this country that we have a politician talking about this. It doesn't further the NDP's agenda in any sense because it's true, as Althia said, the reading of this is that it is a bluff. But at the same time, I think people have a long memory, and people do remember in a moment of crisis, specifically looking at healthcare system in Ontario, for example. In a moment of crisis like this one, I think people do have a memory for saying, I feel like the healthcare system is in crisis, and there's only one politician right now at the federal level who's willing to talk about that. And I think that does serve them, I think, a little bit later, if not right now.
Except, Andrew, the government wants to talk about it. They just don't feel like they're getting the conversations that they want to have.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness to Mr. Singh, the NDP, it's not coincidental, I think, that this was on the same day as the Mississauga-Lakeshore by-election, which I know we're going to talk about later, but where the NDP vote fell to 5%. And he's, I think, in the grip of two things, his party is. One is smaller parties in these types of arrangements typically get forgotten. The government takes credit for their collective achievements, and the smaller party doesn't get any. And secondly, this prospect of an election at some point in the near future where it gets very polarized between the Conservatives and the Liberals, which is always bad for the NDP. So he's got to start making differentiation between the NDP and the Liberals. He's got to start putting distance between them. He's looking at the potential for an election where healthcare, I know healthcare is always talked about as being an issue in an election. This might be an election where it actually is. an important issue. Things have gotten to such a hairy extent with the crisis in healthcare that people may actually be basing their votes on it. And for all these reasons, I think he's got to start putting distance between himself and the Liberals, and this may be the start of that campaign.
Okay, we're not having an election, though.
Yeah, I know. That whole thing made me very worried as well. Chantal then Althia. Chantal then Althia, yeah.
I've got 2 words about that. Alberta and Manitoba, those 2 provinces they are really going to have elections in 2023. What do they have in common? That the NDP is well placed to form government. So if you're going to want to plunge the country in a federal election at the same time as 2 key provinces may be falling to your party, you probably have a scheduling problem.
Oh, I'm not saying he's likely to pull the plug at all. I'm just saying rhetorically he needs to distance himself from the Liberals.
I'm convinced that the Liberals will find a way to be part of the solution on healthcare long before Canadians head to the polls.
Yeah.
Well, that was sort of my next question. I'll go to you for Althia. How does this get unlocked, this impasse that we seem to be in? And I don't think that a meeting now is going to solve the problems we're dealing with now, to be clear, but how does it get unlocked, do you think?
Well, the Prime Minister is meeting with Premier Legault tomorrow, and so we'll see if there is baby steps towards something. But at the moment, and we saw this earlier last month when the health ministers were meeting in Vancouver, where even on simple things they could not agree. I mean, I think, and I don't want to put this all on the province's back, but I think it's entirely understandable for the federal government to want to have outcomes tied to money. And if it's not outcomes tied to money, then it's tax point, but then don't come begging for more money after. And so the provinces keep wanting to have it both ways. And I think the public, at some point, you're looking at a bunch of provinces that are sitting on surpluses. Why is the state of healthcare where it is? I mean, that is not Justin Trudeau's fault. That is a lack of investment from the provinces. Some provinces like Ontario did not even use all the money the federal government gave them during COVID. And so, yes, there is a role for the federal government to play. I genuinely believe that they intend to play a large role. But at some point, the provinces need to agree that what Ottawa is asking for is not the end of the world. Like common metrics so that we can verify and measure outcomes, that is not asking too much.
But the problem, to me, the problem isn't that. The problem is that right now, while the system is sort of in the throes of this crisis, it looks like the federal government is nowhere on this. And I think that is a sort of a more pressing kind of storm. If they can weather this storm, the storm of this winter in the healthcare system, then certainly they can make that argument that actually does not fall on them. The Liberals can make that argument. But while they're in the middle of the storm, I think there's I'm not sure that it reads very well to people that the Liberals are not as engaged in the healthcare debate as maybe they should be.
Well, there's a lot of stuff happening in the background that we don't see because it's not announceable yet.
Yeah,
and the other problem is, suppose that in the spirit of Christmas they all meet next week and they all sing together. Do you think for 1 second that will advance or solve any of the structural issues that will make this winter a really bad winter in the healthcare system? Because it ain't going to happen.
That's exactly right. We have to distinguish between solving a short-term political problem for the federal government, or for the provinces for that matter, by striking quote-unquote a deal, and actually changing anything in the healthcare system. That's going to require much more fundamental reforms at the provincial level and much more fundamental changes to fiscal transfer arrangements. As long as the feds continue to send them cash, whether it has strings attached or not, we're still going to have the blame game. We're still going to have them pointing fingers at each other in place of actually making the hard and difficult reforms that are going to be needed to make the system work better.
This week saw the Mississauga-Lakeshore by-election results, with Liberal MP Charles Sousa winning the riding. Conservatives got back to their old rhetoric right away.
What he has delivered is a 40-year high in inflation, the fastest rising interest rates in Canadian history. 1 in 5 Canadians not able to afford food.
But the Liberals were happy to bring up their victory.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians, like the Canadians in Mississauga-Lakeshore, recognize the rhetoric from the Leader of the Opposition for what it is.
So what do the results mean for the federal parties? Is Pierre Poilievre's momentum slowing, or is there more at play here? Let's bring back our panelists, Chantal, Elamin, Althia, and Andrew. Chantal, why don't you start us off here? What are you taking away from the by-election?
that it is a real Liberal victory that matters not at all to the makeup of the House of Commons and possibly to the outcome of the next federal election, but that will do wonders for party morale and for a sense within that Liberal caucus that Justin Trudeau still has it. That the NDP should be worried about half of its support vanishing while the Liberal support went up over 50%, not so bad in the 905. And that Pierre Poilievre seriously needs to rethink his communication strategy. It's strong on rhetoric, but it's been very, very weak on policy. Serious policy, I mean, not firing the governor of the Bank of Canada.
Andrew?
Well, I'll start with the proviso that we should always be careful about reading too much into one by-election result, but then that's what we're paid for.
Somebody's got to do that.
I think the more interesting, everyone's paying attention to the Conservatives and the Liberal result in this by-election, but perhaps more significant is what happened to these two smaller parties, the NDP and the People's Party. The NDP vote, as we mentioned, was cut in half from 10% to 5%. That's bad for the NDP, but it's maybe even worse for the Conservatives, because what it means is the Liberal strategy of scaring NDP voters into the Liberal camp was, at least on this night, was working. Secondly, the collapse of the People's Party vote, you might think, okay, Conservatives should cheer for that. Probably most of that vote went to the Conservatives, and maybe that's the fruit of Poilievre's strategy. Yep. But if your net result overall is that your vote went down, that means you scared more voters away from you than you attracted from the PPC. You scared more voters towards the Liberals than you attracted from the PPC. And so both of those do not augur well for the Conservatives' overall strategy, and particularly if they're going to try and win these kinds of Ontario suburban ridings, which they have to do if they're going to form a government.
So Pierre Poilievre didn't really mention any of this in his speech to caucus, but I know that he spoke to your colleague at the Star, Althia, or he didn't, but members of the caucus spoke to your colleague, who said, oh, well, he didn't go there. We weren't really fighting for it because we thought we might lose. I mean, that's obviously the spin they're putting on it, but what do you make of what actually happened?
He went to the ridings around Mississauga-Lakeshore. He just didn't go to Mississauga-Lakeshore.
Right.
Like, truthfully, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because if this was a general election, you'd expect the leader of the party to go at least show up in a riding that could swing. And it is a riding that could swing. It swung in 2011. And yes, it did swing because the NDP vote was way high because the Liberal vote collapsed. But that strategy of, the Conservatives winning the GTA because the NDP is strong is not a strategy that they should be banking on. I think that's a discussion we've had for years. This by-election is really perplexing to me because the Conservatives did not advertise in the riding. The leader did not go to the riding. It's clear they helped the candidate. Like, he was repeating the same talking points that we hear in the House of Commons. So he did get help from the party, but he's not from the riding. He didn't show up to any debates. He didn't grant any interviews. Like, if you were trying not to win, this is kind of the strategy that you would deploy. But what message does that send to Conservatives on the ground in that riding? I'm told that the membership numbers actually for the party in that riding are larger than their actual turnout. I don't know if that's true or not, but that seems a little perplexing. So I feel like maybe they were testing something out. I want to believe that because it's the only thing that would make sense.
Sure.
Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, this was a Liberal riding that the party needed to win. Yes, they feel energized, but they also ran a superstar candidate. Like, this should have been a cakewalk for them. So I think we need to put all that in perspective. Like, maybe the result is not actually that bad for the Conservatives, taking all those things into account.
Elamin?
I think that's the thing that sticks out for me is like the idea that, you had a leader that didn't really campaign in this. You had a party that was not as engaged in this campaign as they could have been. Certainly they did not put as much resources or effort into trying to win it, and then they lost 1 point. That's actually a pretty good news story, considering all things considered. I think the idea that this is the bigger loss for the NDP, that is the story here. The notion that the NDP has dropped in votes by half after spending a year trying to take credit for a lot of, significant Liberal moves and saying, okay, this only happened because the NDP has this power sharing agreement. That is not bearing out in a riding that would ideally be a place where you test that strategy. And it clearly, the electors are not seeing that.
Chantal.
To go back to Andrew's point, a bad night for the NDP and a good night for the Liberals is a nightmare for the Conservatives. Yeah. 1, 2, Poilievre doesn't campaign, so he doesn't have to wear the defeat. He wears the defeat.
Yes.
It's the first by-election and a winnable riding. And 3, star candidate Charles Sousa lost that riding at the provincial level, same area. to a Conservative in 2018. So there is there are voters who are willing to vote for a Conservative party, one led by Doug Ford in this case. So the notion that this was not a winnable riding, or this is such a great star candidate that as an outgoing finance minister, he couldn't hold the seat provincially. Bottom line,
it was a wave
bad
too.
Conservative night.
We didn't win because we didn't try is not really a very impressive message.
No, it's
not. And secondly, this comes after months of pretty steady bad news for the government, whether it's on inflation or the airport mess, et cetera, et cetera. This was a winnable riding in that kind of circumstance.
So would you expect, though, Pierre Poilievre to shift then his strategy? Is there any evidence that he learns lessons and adjusts his strategy, Althia?
Well, we talked about this a little bit last week when he came out and actually spoke to reporters. And at the time, I framed it, I think, as like an effort to depress Liberal voters. Like, you can't talk to Liberal voters if you don't actually go out and reach them. I think the party will have to rethink its strategy come the new parliamentary sitting. I mean, this week they were given a gift in the form of International Trade Minister Mary Ng being found to have broken the Conflict of Interest Act by awarding 2 contracts to a very close friend of hers, who also happens to be a close friend of the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, and also CBC pundit. I guess I probably should say that as a disclosure. But and instead of going hard at this, they kept on the affordability line that we have heard. And I was going back at archival tapes for our podcast this weekend, unrelated. But back in the 80s and 90s, when there was a prime minister with an ethical conflict, QP was all about that. Like, they really wanted that minister to resign, and they made a point. He's not making news out of question period. So how are they using question period? Like that they need to rethink this communication strategy. Chantal had a good column on that a few weeks ago.
Last word, Chantal.
By the way, if you could win an election out of question period, Thomas Mulcair would be Prime Minister.
That's right. He thinks there's going to be an election. He's the only one that does right now. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you all.